Howdy. Happy Friday. Today's a little different video. I thought I might talk a little bit about my approach and development philosophy for my side project. And pardon me if it gets a little rambly. Most of these are unscripted, single take videos. Don't have much time for much else. But really thinking about maybe diving in a little bit about sort of my development philosophy, how I'm approaching it, particularly within the sort of scope of the kind of project I'm doing, why I'm doing that kind of a one, and then maybe a short sort of a vertical slice dive into how I'm implementing that philosophy in a particular system with a look at some documentation on that. So to sort of, since maybe you can guess from some of the other videos, I'm making a sort of a procedural VR fantasy game, although while it will still also, it will be VR, I've noted, I'll probably also think about maybe having a first person mode to it. It depends. But I'm thinking that I'll probably want to have that at least for just speed of development on some things. But I did mention it was going to be tangential. And my sort of bad elevator pitch is the one sentence elevator pitch is No Man's Skyrim. And I came up with that before No Man's Sky was making No Man's Skyrim. Light No Fire does look pretty cool. But one of the things that I, as a player, really enjoy, and while I'm not historically a designer, I do think a lot about game design, think would be a really fun design, development, and coding space is sort of systematized and kind of loot-driven gameplay, and that idea of, surprise and delight and stumbling into something that, is just wow, right? You get those player moments, and also binding that by the sort of reality of I'm a single person, and though as a tech artist, I've done sort of all parts of game development, looking at what is possible for a single developer who is working full time, and what are sort of the requirements I should put in front of myself. Because I did start up a different side project a long time ago, and while I had the technical ability to be able to develop that, at that point I didn't have sort of a support plan, a business plan, other stuff. It was for a game called, I was calling Shifter, and the idea there was it was a kind of a werewolf, werebear, other forms game, and it's going to be really cool with some heavy technology around like morph targets and morph target combat, and really cool universal character mesh. And on my other YouTube channel, there's some old videos where you can see some the player character model that I modeled specifically for this and set it up for all of that. But what I quickly realized was it was going to take a monumental amount of effort for a very small amount of gameplay, and sort of thinking about like what the player was going to be doing, right? And so I could work a few years on the project and maybe end up with 45 minutes or something of playable enjoyment time. And I think a lot of that would have been at a low quality bar for the type of game it was going to be. It was going to be very, action combat kind of a thing. And I started up another side project because I was feeling sort of a lack of creative output. Oh, lovely. Chocolate in the keyboard. A while back, just doing heavy pipeline work. And so I was like, well, I want to do a side project, and I also want to keep my skills sharp with the industry. And so I was thinking about my side project and scope and design. I actually spent a lot of time in paper and in documenting and in sort of mind palace thinking about scope and design and systems and how I would go about development in a way that was actually going to be sort of possible to do something, to deliver something. And if you look at some of the other videos I probably only have spread out over the thing a couple of, I don't know, weeks of development time into the project, of actual, like it's a development time, because it's all, one day a week. After work, I've got a kid and a real job and other hobbies and stuff too. But scope and design, specifically and carefully designing it to be achievable, and who knows if I'll ever ship this product, but even if I don't, it's a fantastic basis for personal development. And I have fun when I'm doing it. So that's one of the things that really matters too, is building a game that's heavily systems based. I knew it's going to need to be procedural. I know I want it to have replayability. I know I want it to have be something where I can commit a lot of time to it or a little bit of time to it, and that can still, we'll say in a post-launch state, translate to value to the customer at some interval, right? Because who knows, maybe this could be some hit or not, but if I put it out there, I wanted to be able to deliver content on an ongoing basis. And if that content has to be sort of large monolithic ads, then that's going to be really hard and inconsistent. And so this led me to thinking about how I would design. And I also took a lot of things I don't like in games that I wanted to like maybe avoid, right? Like inventory, like excessive inventory management, and sort of, I have a whole thing here on depth of inventory management, and sort of shout out to Wyatt Chang for giving me a review on that a long time ago, but and contributing some cool ideas. But sort of for me, I really enjoy like Skyrim, like not for the story, but walking around in the woods and seeing that fucking castle on the hill and be like, what's in there? And you go in there and there's like, you go through the dungeon, and depending on your play style, you play through it very differently, and there's like, maybe a hidden chest somewhere, and you fight some boss and he drops some cool sword or whatever, right? The second time you play through Skyrim, you're like, wait a minute, is this that weird fort that has like the necromancer who's making magic spiders? And you're like, oh, I did. And you halfway through it, you're like, oh yeah, this is that place. And that kind of spark of joy kind of goes away a bit, right? And so that's kind of why No Man's Skyrim is, I knew procedural was going to have to be a thing. So I think about what value are we delivering to players? How are we delivering that to them? And sort of a system-based approach allows you to do a lot of horizontal content development and add it in. And I'll talk about kind of how that plays out with the weapon system. I'll talk about the weapon system and the magic weapon system. I also have a magic armor system, which is very similar. But just kind of looking at, hey, this month, maybe I was tight on time, and all I was able to deliver was because real life was there, and I had family commitments or whatever. Maybe the dream someday is that I take this project and turn it into a startup and get actual people working on it, but whatever. But today it's a side project. And so, hey, this month, maybe all I did was add a new magic sword effect. But that can actually have quite a bit of, and you'll see kind of how and how I'm thinking about it, quite a bit of impact to the player base, right? Be like, hey, look, patch 1.2.2, 2 new sword blade models and 1 new magic sword effect and 1 new axe handle or something like that, right? Not super impressive, not a lot of stuff, but it's a thing, right? And then players pick it up, and with a procedural and system-based game, the next time they go loot a chest, they may find the new magic sword effect or whatever, right? So on the new sword model, so sword blade model. So that has the ability to add a whole lot of horizontal development. I think it also sets up for, one thing I'd love to do in the future, if possible, is look at user generated content. I'm going to be using I'm using Unreal Engine because another part of my development strategy as well. Definitely not making my own engine. Well, I think that's interesting work. What I want to look at doing is actually building the game and not building the technology to make the and building systems inside of a proven technology. One of the reasons I picked things up again here very recently is I changed jobs 3 times in 2 years, and that was a nightmare. Don't recommend. Moved states and some other stuff happened, and but also with the 5.2 with Unreal 5, that brought a lot of things to the table I wanted to look at, and that happened after I was doing my initial work. And 5.2 with his PCG, obviously for a procedural game, PCG is huge, right? And additionally, with the implementation of things like GitHub Copilot, I'll be able to, I think, develop the C++ parts of the game that I was going to need to develop much faster, and also not hurt my wrist as much. So looking at kind of building the whole game out in a way where things are data-driven, things are procedural, and systematized, where any particular system can get expanded on, right? From buildings and NPCs and equipment and armor and weapons and all that stuff. And so before I dive into some of the magic weapon documentation stuff, I'll kind of talk about my approach. And so one of the things I kind of really enjoyed with a game like Diablo, especially like I said, Diablo 2 and also Diablo 3, and a slight bit as well Diablo 4, although I wish respecing was a little different there. But I love picking up a new weapon and then thinking about how that affects my character and their abilities and how I play the character, right? So like, hey, here's a sword that does this, that makes me my magic. But in those games, your character brings a lot to the table. So there's character classes and all this other stuff. And I'm sort of looking at the idea of, hey, well, I've been playing a lot of roguelikes for a little while. And one of the things that's kind of fun there is you go in and you start playing your character and you kind of build your character as you play through a run, right? And one of the things I'll talk about is how with the systems kind of style build design in here, sort of my primary game mode I think I want to be is a sort of never-ending persistent mode. But it would also lend the design of all of this would sort of lend itself well to taking the systems in there and accelerating them rapidly and throwing them into sort of like a Iron Man roguelike kind of a prospect as well. And so thinking about my systems, because of the way I've designed it, I think I could plug it into a few different kinds of play styles. But I love that kind of, I picked up a new weapon. Let me do some stuff with this, right? How does that affect my character? Do I change some of my character around? And do I change what skills I'm using because I got a sword of fireballs bounce or whatever, right? And one of the things I've often disliked in games is when you have, actually I guess now is just a good time to open up sort of the weapon design and the weapon magic effects here. So a lot of my documents are sort of stream of consciousness for me. I haven't gone back and reviewed this in a little while, but one of the other things is I have sort of a very strong vision and design sense for what I'm going to be building. And I spend a lot of time sitting down to think about what that direction is. And so when I sit down to fill out another document or a form or another thing, there's not as much sort of sitting around and wondering, right? I have some guiding pillars for the game and some other stuff. Like do no harm to multiplayer. That's a stretch goal for the project. But and so thinking about how I would apply a lot of the things to this, that like one of the things that I hated about, for example, even though I love the game, like Skyrim with like magic weapons, was like my magic sword has batteries. Oh, I have a lot of Skyrim's a fantastic, amazing game, but I do have a lot of sort of personal design issues with it. One of the nice things is that you can mod that game, so you can kind of tweak some of it to your desires. But I also don't like constantly opening my inventory and figuring out what the best item to weight, like dollar to weight ratio of the items I'm carrying is. But if you're in a game and you get like a really cool sword, and mechanically it's doing something very fun for you, and you gain 3 levels or whatever, and now an item level 14, boring ass, unenchanted, white, sword drops, and it's just mathematically superior because the base item damage has gone up enough. Like, that's one of those points in a game for me where I'm like, oh man, sucks. Like, I've got this cool, hammer of knockback, and that's very fun because guys walk up to me and I hit them with my hammer of knockback, and then I lob a fireball at their feet or something, whatever. It's doing something fun like that. But now, that's a level 3 hammer. Now I'm at level 12, and these level 12 hammers are dropping it. Damn, like I could just be killing things, in one hit with the regular hammer, that now I have to go do a whole bunch of, like, this has become sort of inferior. And so one of the things that I am looking at doing, and who knows, once I get to play testing and all that other stuff, minds may change, but is the base sort of damage on your weapons doesn't actually change over time. A level 50 sword and a level 1 sword that are a long sword do 10 damage, whatever it is, right? And so you'll have different kinds, and they'll have sort of different implicit properties on them, right? And there's some stuff about balancing in there, so we're like thinking about like, well, hey, especially for VR, right? We're just a longer sword because we're not dealing damage in a hit box with a player button push or whatever. Where a longer sword just sort of is naturally stronger than a shorter sword is. Well, maybe we end up balancing that in. Maybe there's stuff like, hey, longer sword has lower crit chance and shorter swords have higher crit chances, or something like that. I don't know. And maybe we even have an automated weapon balancing thing that just sort of takes volume of your damage hitbox on your weapon. And sort of the bigger that is, we tweak some stuff. I don't know. Those are, like I said, things we'll think about later. I want most things to run through a modular system. I do want to have some, like a mechanic for some handcrafted items, like very rare, unique items. And some things that could be fun. They'd probably heavily leverage the system I'm about to go into, but who knows? Maybe they have some bespoke code on them or whatever. And so they'll probably still use the system. There just might be enchantment effects that don't happen on any other thing. But who knows? Whatever. So the idea is that while a level 1 sword, a sword, your item level sort of is equivalent to the monster level it drops off of. Pretty standard stuff. For my game, I want to look at difficulties, basically being like, hey, scale the monster level relative to your level. They'll drop gear that is at their level. So if you fight harder monsters, you get better loot faster. If you want to take it easier, your loot item level progression curve will happen slower, right? And so that's sort of my rough idea there. But the idea is maybe at higher levels, certain looks of weapons will start to happen, right? So like, hey, you've got your locked standard longsword. Suddenly at level 15, now you can find the elvish longsword. And it is systemically identical to a regular longsword. And then at level 30, you find an orcish longsword, and then at 50, you find a demonic longsword, whatever, right? So cooler looks are locked to higher levels, and maybe even certain mob types or whatever. Who knows, maybe, normally you can start seeing orcish weapons at level 30, but if you go find some orcs, maybe they're all wielding orcs and you can pick their shit up. Which actually plays into, I'd kind of like my NPCs to actually just be wielding the equipment that they drop, right? And I'd like you not to want to pick up everything on an NPC. But I'm not going to diverge into inventory management. I can talk about that later. If people find these kind of, my design kind of chats interesting. Also, if you have feedback, love to hear it in the comments or DM me, message me or whatever. But to get back to like the system and the design of it, a level 50 longsword versus a level 1 longsword will have 50 enchantment points rather than 1, right? And I want to kind of throw that in there up front, right? And so the idea here is that the base item isn't going to scale crazy, but the possibility of getting a better item is higher with higher item levels, and the possibility of getting different kinds of effects at higher item levels. And so while this won't eliminate going like, oh, hey, I've got my fun throwing hammer of returning of knockback, right? That may always, and that's the other thing, is I want a lot of my magic effects to be sort of changing your gameplay. They'll still have math and damage associated with them, but I want you to maybe think about what this weapon means and how that affects your gameplay and how you interact with the game world. And I think in VR that you have a lot more sort of options there. But the idea being, like I said, you have 50 enchantment levels worth of stuff on your weapons, right? And so we've got some different ones, but one of the basic things that I think I'm going to roll with is you have 3 or 4. I'm still sort of deciding. Components to a weapon, right? And so you've got the handle, and then like on a sword, you've got the guard and the blade. And if I go with 4, then on a sword, maybe you got the pommel, right? And then on an axe, you've got the handle, you've got the haft, you've got the axe head, right? On a hammer or a mace, same thing. Handle, haft, axe head. The weapon models are all going to be modularly split up like that, so that looks and appearances can randomize on them. And then basically, and I'm also going to be, I'll go into magic a little bit in this video, but not fully. I have a whole document on magic spells and their and enchantments that affect magic spells as well. And spells are going to be sort of granted by equipments, right? So you'll get a wand of fireball, right? Or, gloves of fucking frost lasers or whatever, right? And so I've got a bunch of kind of item types associated with that. So I want to do like 2-hand staves versus 1-hand wands are different, rings, that kind of stuff. Again, not going to dive too deep into magic, but I kind of want the gear that's on your player to make you think about how you play at any given time, and for you to be able to really kind of create your own classes through the gear you have equipped, right? And so you want to be thinking about interesting gameplay on your gear rather than all of the mathy stats. There'll still be some stats in there, but I can talk about player stats later. But like as an example, for something like strength, I'm going to have strength, but it's not going to be about do 1.1x more damage to with melee weapons or something like that, right? It's going to be more about like, hey, how much weight can you pick up, right? And sort of like, hey, can I bash down this door, right? Because that was one of the things I always wanted to see like in games was like, hey, I'm a level like 100 barbarian, like, maybe I just could just doors aren't a thing anymore. Kind of like that, to bring some of that D&D kind of stuff into there. I mean, like, what do player stats actually mean, right? Like, you're not stacking strength because you want to do these things, and so I maybe even in combat, like the hey, can you parry the ogre swing, right? Like, do you have to have more strength, and kind of basically bring it into the physics of the game. So it's like, hey, there's a boulder out there and it weighs 2,000 pounds, and you need, whatever you can lift 10 pounds per point of strength, or whatever the magic number ends up being. And it's like, well, you can't pick it up, or you can. And then being like, oh, well, Because I think in VR, this could be pretty cool of like, oh, well, pick up this environment interactable thing and then just fucking like throw it at the guy, right? And, like throwing boulders downhill in Zelda is like one of the cool things where you can't pick them up, but like rolling a boulder into a camp, so fun. Picking up a treasure chest and carrying it somewhere else, right? Like if you can't open it, or just bashing it open. I have a lot of thoughts about treasure chests, which I'll get into later if people are interested in these videos. But the idea being that different enchants, going back to the weapons, like I said, I'm a little tangent prone. Different sections of the weapons can have different enchants associated with them, right? And so you can think about, and then different kinds of weapons have different things associated with them. And so I've kind of got a, table of magic weapons here. And like some things are sort of generic, and some things are, they'll be associated with a part of the weapon. They'll have an enchantment cost. So a lot of the things I've been telling you are sort of context for looking at this, right? And so, hey, frost, fire, shock. Whoa. Yeah, I know you're shocked even that I have these basic ones. But kind of like for me, I'm like, is it really a fantasy game if you can't get a flaming longsword? Like, I may have a irrational attachment to flaming longswords, but but I also want them like, hey, what is the primary effect? And so all of these enchantments are designed to be stackable and scalable, because I don't want to implement like an arbitrary level cap on my game. I'm not looking at like competitive PvP or anything like that. And so if you get to level, I don't know, 7,000 because you're a streamer who spent 5 years playing the game straight, cool. Do you instantly murder everything with death eye lasers? Cool. Like, who cares? Break the game, have fun. That's what RPGs are for. And so, but I'd like you to think about, like I said, but in this case, so like, for example, the Frost enchantment, and this is actually one of the ones I sort of started noodling around with in Unreal first, not from a visual perspective, right? Is like, hey, it converts a portion of your damage to element, right? But then it also, I want it to slowly build up. So one of the things for your character, I'm currently planning on you having 4 loadouts. If you played Robo Recall, I really liked the 4 weapon loadout system that they had. The idea of like hip hip and back back, right? Very fun for VR gameplay, and I'm thinking that we could maybe even get into some of that kind of feeling of Robo Recall with the player power. If you haven't played Robo Recall, you should check it out, because the player power fantasy in that is amazing. You go in and you teleport and you pull the 2 shotguns off and you're like boom boom boom, and then you see a bullet come over your shoulder and you're like, oh, and you're pulling your weapons out and you're doing the thing, and then when they run out of ammo or whatever, you throw them away. They respawn, right? And so they come back to your slots afterwards, right? And so, but not only do you use yours, but you can pick up stuff, like you can pick up an enemy's weapon and then do the thing, and yours are probably better, but theirs may also be good. But there's just this like, but you do have to. It's enough to have variety, but it's not so many that you have everything you want, right? So you still have to make hard decisions, right? So, right, like, hey, do you on your loadout in my game, like, do you have 2 wands, right? You like wands grant your magic spells, and staves do. Staves are 2-handed, but I'm thinking that if you have a staff, it takes up like, right, like the staves maybe come with 2 spells and they have some different kinds of enchants on them. I have some of that written down. It's been a little while, but like if you go with 4 wands, then you get 4 spells in your immediate loadout, right? So that gives you the most sort of spell casting flexibility possibly, right? Now, if you're in, and so, but you could also do a wand and shield, right? So do you sacrifice one of your spell slots to gain blocking, right? Because wand and shield could be, you can grab here, grab here, grab here. Do you want to be like that fighter who's like, hey, if you want to sacrifice 2 of your loadout slots to like a shield and a healing wand or whatever, right? Then you're like, okay, I can go turtle up and cast my healing spell. I've used half my inventory for that. I've used half my loadout for that, right? But that's the thing. And so you could have like 2 melee weapons, a shield and a wand, right? And then, maybe you're that guy who just really likes one-hand maces, and you rock 4 one-hand maces with different enchantments on them, right? Maybe you have a one-hand mace for every element, and then you got a throwing one, whatever, right? Like, I kind of want the players to be able to, like I said, build what they want to have. And so the idea here is, hey, Frost, to get back, again, tangents, but I'm explaining a lot. Kind of Frost weapon, I kind of want to build up over time, right? So its kind of differences is like, the longer it goes between hits, the more sort of frost builds up and it crusts on it. And this shows visually through like crystals growing on the sword, on the weapon, and frost effects and stuff first, and then it'll hit a maximum, and then it'll go up over time. And oh yeah, the other thing about my magic effects is I want all of them to be stackable, right? And so I want them to have every level of the spell effect, and then where applicable also have a sort of, we'll call it a breakpoint effect, right? And so over time it builds up, and then when you hit, it does maybe a lot more damage than you would deal per hit with a fire or shock or a raw weapon or whatever. But the idea is that the frost shatters at that point and resets to 0 frostiness, whatever you want to call it, frostification. And then it starts building up over time. So, but with this idea, like you've got a loadout, you could have like one of your slots be dedicated to a big nasty one-hit sort, like a frost weapon. Maybe you go into combat and you unload with it. Maybe you even throw it, right, or whatever. But you unload with it. You sneak, you sneak attack. You just run in and you blow your frost basically cooldown. Then you swap to your fire or your shock weapon, or I've got a whole bunch of other ones, right? And so the idea of like, hey, fire converts to poison element and probably adds a sort of damage over time component. But one of the things about fire weapons is I want it to be like, hey, maybe you just burn stuff with them. And while I want probably all the magic weapons to some degree, maybe not all, but we'll have like some sort of a glow or some sort of a light contribution. Maybe fire weapons are like really bright, have a really large light radius. So like when you're in a dark dungeon or whatever, like the fire handles itself. But also like, and I think this would be extra satisfying in VR. There was a VR game I played that did this, but it's like, for some reason it's so satisfying. Like when you're, I forget which VR game it was, but like I had a torch, and there were like unlit torches on the wall in the dungeon, and I could just light the torches with my torch, and it was just, I don't know, it was really satisfying. So the idea of like, hey, I have a fire weapon, and I can light these unlit torches in this dungeon, right? Maybe I can light some stuff on fire with it. Who knows? Maybe I don't really want to necessarily have things like survival and hunger and all that stuff, but like maybe you can cook shit or whatever. I don't know. And hey, like some of these non-combat effects, right? They're like stretch goals, but like, hey, what if you could like freeze water with your ice weapon? What if you could freeze locks on a treasure chest, and then now you could smash the treasure chest, kind of like breaking the T-1000 after liquid nitrogen or something. I don't know. And then shock weapons convert to percent to element damage, but they can arc to other enemies, right? And so shock is actually, I think, a really cool case of like how it could scale over time, right? Where shock, I also want shock to be able to, it would prioritize bad guys, but also to be able to target breakables in the environment. Because when you cast chain lightning in a room, uh, breaking boxes and stuff is just like amazing with it. But is scaling the distance it will arc, right? So a level, so for every stack of shock you get on the weapon, and I'll talk about how enchants stack here in a second, it will arc further, right? And so, and then, but the breakpoint effect would be maybe every 5 or 10 levels of shock on your weapon, you can arc to an additional target, right? So let's say it was, every 10 levels. So if you somehow had a level 100 sword and the only enchants on it were all shock, right? Then it would bounce maybe, I don't know, 100 meters or something, or whatever the number ends up being. But it would bounce really far between bounces, and it would bounce to 10 targets, right? Like I said, the specific numbers there are unimportant. But that's an interesting thing of now you start thinking about, well, hey, I may walk into combat, maybe I hit something with my frost weapon on the really big, mean-looking guy, and then, but there's all of his lackeys, or we've in an ad phase or something or whatever, there's a whole bunch of small guys. I'm going to break out my shock weapon, and I'm going to start smacking and just mob trash clearing with my shock weapon. And so your different kinds of enchantments play into combat in different kinds of ways, right? And then, again, I'm doing a lot of designing around this in VR, but, also, like I said, I think I'm going to probably do first person on this as well. I'm just thinking about animation costs. That falls back to my development strategy of just being me. And so some of these enchants, you have to have another enchant in order to get them. So we can talk about like, hey, elemental slash, like in order to be eligible to find this on a weapon, that weapon has to already have one of these other enchants to have rolled on it first, right? And so the idea here is if you swing your weapon, there may be like waves of elemental damage that roll off of it, right? And so as it scales, it goes further. It has a larger hitbox, but just sort of like think about like, blade waves on weapons, that kind of stuff. So, and these are all associated with the damage part. So these would all roll on the blade of the sword and the head of the axe, etc. And then you have like, hey, maybe this one's fun, just like pure elemental form. Maybe it doesn't stack. It's not actually stacking, but it just converts all of your damage to that element, which, I'm still thinking about how elements play into the game. You don't want it to be punishing, but hopefully in this game you'll be encouraged to use lots of weird stuff. So if you have a 100% fire sword and you run into a fire dragon, that you're not totally fucked because you have something else cool too. But we'll see. And so, like, hey, another one that would be fun is like throwing weapon of returning, right? So, hey, if you throw your weapon, it comes back after, and so, now you can get your sort of fiery throwing weapon of returning, right? And then I'm thinking that like if you don't have a throwing weapon of returning after you throw or drop your weapon, there'll be some time period before it comes back to you. And maybe some weapons or some enchantments or something else will like lower that. Like maybe daggers, just like part of their balance is that if you throw them, they come back really quickly, like, in a second or something. I don't know, whatever. So, and there's some other fun ones in here, but, just thinking aloud for some other stuff of like, hey, and then like, hey, some ones that are specific to like swords, right? And so like, hey, Vorpal, like I think I want to have dismemberment in my game. We'll see how that goes. But if I do, right, then probably have some system of when you deal enough hit points to a part, that part sort of gains a percentage of total body hit points or whatever. If you exceed that, you cut the part off. But Vorpal will maybe do just 2x dismemberment damage, right? And so if you lose the limb, you lose all the hit points associated with it. If it was your sword arm, well, you don't have your freaking sword anymore or whatever, right? That's all stuff that I think would be cool. We'll see if it makes the cutting. It may be one of those things that comes in a later update. Because remember, I'm talking about a lot about like horizontal system-based design. And then there's just some like crazy ideas of stuff like space-time slice. Like maybe you cut a hole in space-time and it creates a black hole that sucks bad guys in. But maybe there's a downside to that of like their loot went with them. And maybe it sucks things in the room away and just, removes the actors, scales down the actors, and then they go poof, and then just despawns them. If you wanted their loot, too bad. But I think that could be just like, but that's the kind of thing of like, well, hey, that's like maybe a level 100. So you can't find that until you kill a level 100 bad guy and he drops a sword, right? And those are kind of cool things where I could be able to add that stuff in at low level or at high level, and then players would have to discover it. And I think that's one of those cool things of like I add that update, and maybe like I add them things in an update, and then players discover it, and then maybe like I don't know, you wait till people have discovered it, and then we release it in the patch notes or whatever for the wiki or so. I don't know, but I'd like players to be able to discover kind of stuff like that and have those moments. Right, and then maybe after, so maybe I'm thinking a lot of my chants might have a first level cost, and then after that, what is the second? So in this case of like, hey, Vorpal costs 50 just for the first level, so that means you can't find it before level 50. But at level 60, you can find a Vorpal +2 sword, right, of other shit, and then like Harpoon could be cool. It's like, hey, it requires another enchant of throwing weapon, but maybe you can like fucking throw your sword and it sticks in a guy, and then it drags the guy back to you, right? And then you could have some fun combos of like, I throw my harpoon weapon at the guy, then I grab my other weapon, and then I boom, And so, if you ever played Jedi Knight 2 at Outcast, one of my favorite combos was to force pull someone and then hit them with my lightsaber. And so I think this could be a fun way to do something like that. And then another one could be fun was like sword blade projectile. If you ever saw the old, like, was it like Dragon Slayer? Was it Dragon Slayer Sword and Sorcery? There's some cheesy 80s fucking fantasy movie where the guy had 3 blades on a sword and you could shoot the blades off like missiles. I actually think I have a video of that right here. Yeah, dumb movies. Here we go. Here, we just got to show the... I can't not show you the thing real quick. There you go. So this gets into that idea, right, of, well, blunt weapons maybe have things like, hey, knockback. Maybe you can only have knockback on blunt weapons. And so, like, hey, and this kind of talks back to, like, you don't necessarily stop using a weapon when you've leveled up. Because maybe you found a throwing knockback hammer of one-hand hammer of returning. Right? And the idea there is like, you throw it, and the guy gets knocked back, right? And well, if you're on a castle wall, that's really fun. Or if you're in a room with spike traps, right, or whatever. It could be the kind of thing of like, if you don't find one of those for 30 levels, that weapon can still be very good because it may be the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I'm on a high up, Now, if you knock the guy off the castle, maybe he falls down with his loot or whatever. That's a whole separate problem in games where you're like, does the loot drop off the guy? Does it spawn like, irretrievable loot? That's its own problem. But, hey, maybe you do, Bone Breaker or Shield Breaker. Like maybe you can get like a magic hammer that does percentage extra damage to shield specifically, right? Or armor sundering or like shockwave. things like that are like, hey, what are, uh, you know, again, don't know if I'll do it, but like lumberjack, like maybe your sword, maybe your axe does extra damage to things that are wooden, right? Um, Headsman, like it's kind of like Vorpal, but it's cheaper. You can get it earlier, but it only works for the head, right? Um, and This one was just a goofy one, which is like maybe you can carve like fleshy meat things off of your opponent as you kill them, and you can eat them like a potion. I don't know, right? But there's just, and then uh, I did a lot of thinking about bows actually, where you get like, hey, pierce. This one's sort of more obvious, but it's like piercing, ricochet, homing, explosive arrow, and kind of the idea of like, well, hey, like maybe if you're like a super archer, you actually have like 4 different bows that fit different roles. Because like a homing arrow, like homing of piercing, if you think of the old burrito cannon from D2, right? Of like it's going back and forth, and so maybe you get a certain number. You get a certain number of pierces. That's sort of easy, right? Homing, the higher the value, I think probably the tighter the turning radius. And there's already a stat for this on Unreal. And so like, right, like one of those things that would be really good in sort of more of an outdoor area is a homing bow of piercing, right? Because effectively at that point, every arrow fire is multiple arrow fires, right? And then, hey, maybe at some point you get like multi-arrow, right? And so you'd be like a multi-homing piercing arrow, right, is like, whoa, right? And your numbers start to get crazy. And then, but if you're inside of a dungeon, like a ricochet bow of explosive arrow starts to look really cool, where now maybe you're like, well, a homing bow sounds nice, but maybe it can't turn tight enough indoors, right? Like maybe it's, and so you might break out your ricochet bow of explosion, and like the higher the stacks of your explosion enchant, the bigger the radius of the explosion. The higher the stacks of your ricochet enchant, the greater the number of times it can bounce. And so maybe you end up having this different playstyle where you're indoors and you're like, actually what I want to do is aim like obliquely at the floor near that pack of guys, so it'll like kind of around them, and right, and again get you thinking about how does your weapon and its effects affect your gameplay. And again, so maybe some fun ones like harpoon arrow, right, retrieve stuff, and then maybe this is based on weight and some stuff, but pinning arrow. If you ever played, what was it, Painkiller? Those freaking the stake launcher. And so, maybe some other weird, dumb, fun things too. Like maybe this bow shoots swords. I don't know. If you played, I haven't decided how serious or not serious I want my game to be. Probably not super serious. Like I don't want it to necessarily be like super crazy, but like if you've played Tiny Tina's, I'm just a huge fan. And so, and then shields can have some ones. And one of the things I want to do is I'd love to have, locally hosted co-op sort of for this. And so shields have some interesting things where maybe like maybe you don't use one a whole lot, but maybe you use one when you're playing multiplayer or whatever. But there's some fun things here of like, well, hey, what if you had a shield of see-through that was like a big tower shield of see-through or whatever, and then like maybe like hey, a Captain America shield, but like a see-through one. Maybe there's one that also will let arrows like through it in one direction, and so maybe like you're the frontline fighter guy, you're walking down the hallway, and your archer friend's behind you, and he can shoot through your shield, right? Block explosion and other fun magnetic. I was trying to think of a lot of really fun, more sort of gameplay kind of style of things, like hey, arrow attract could be really cool. And so that's just sort of, I've been going on a while now, so I think I will. I was thinking about dipping into like the spell effects and spells a little bit, but I think I'll save that for a different one if you guys find this interesting. this has been a long ramble, but I haven't told many people about the sort of intent of my side project outside of a couple small group of friends. So if you find that interesting, let me know. If you're following the games channel, thank you, and happy Friday. Cheers.